Hello, today I'm going to be reviewing the Phanteks NV7 and answering not only the question if this should be your next PC, but if this should be my next PC, because I think we finally might have a contender who can knock the O11 Dynamic Evo off the desk behind me. So let's dive in and take a closer look. So the Phanteks NV7 is available in two different colours, black and white. They're both priced the same. In the UK it's going to cost you just under £200, while in the US it's just under $220. So as well as needing plenty of money, you're also going to need plenty of space if you're interested in getting the Phanteks NV7, and it is an absolute beast, particularly in terms of height, where it measures in at 586mm tall. To remove the tempered glass side panel, we first need to open the mesh door at the back of the case. There's two captive thumb screws we need to loosen, and then the tempered glass side panel can be slid backwards, tilted out and lifted away. To remove the tempered glass panel at the front, first of all there's two screws you're going to need to loosen, and then the panel can be slid to the side and lifted away. To remove the top panel again, we've got two captive thumb screws at the back we need to loosen, and then the panel can be slid backwards and lifted away. If we take a look at the back of the panel we've just removed, you'll notice there's no separate dust filter, although the holes in the mesh are fairly fine. While we're at the top of the case, you'll notice we've got some buttons. The large one is our power button, and the other four buttons are to control the case's built-in dual-channel ARGB controller. If you're planning on going with a custom loop, you'll be pleased to see we've got a cutout for a fill port at the top. If we take a look at the rear of the case, you'll notice we've got this mesh door on it. The idea behind this is it should improve the aesthetics at the rear of the case, and hopefully because the panel's made of mesh, this won't come at the expense of airflow. With the top panel removed, it is possible to remove this mesh door at the back, and all you simply need to do is lift it upwards to remove it. So your power supply is going to go at the top, and then we've got all these cable management clips that are going to manage your cables coming from the power supply and your motherboard. There's also a Velcro cable strap down towards the bottom, and then at the bottom of the case we've got more of these organizer clips to help manage all the cables. If you prefer, there's a rubber grommet at the bottom you can bring all your cables through, and importantly this is big enough for your power supply cable, but whichever of these methods you go for with the mesh panel then closed at the back, it's going to look really clean. Another thing to point out, if you are planning on going with a custom loop, you'll be pleased to see we've got a cutout for a drain port at the back. To remove our other side panel, there's a single screw at the top which we're going to need to remove. You're not able to get your fingers underneath the panel, but there is two cutouts at the top to get your fingers into, and then you can lift the panel straight up and away. If we take a closer look at this panel, you'll notice we've got a mesh area on it to provide intake for our power supply, but again we've got no separate dust filter. Taking a look to the left of the panel we've just removed, you'll notice we've got a large mesh area, indicating that we're going to be able to side mount fans and radiators in the case. If we take a look in from the tempered glass side, you'll notice that the bottom of the case is very close to the table and you might be worried about airflow. However, if we go to the other side, you'll notice that we've got absolutely loads of room. And the reason for this is because the bottom of the case is actually on an incline. So I think this is going to work really well in terms of aesthetics, because when we look in from the tempered glass side, it's going to look really clean. It's going to give you a nice tilted option for the fans at the bottom of the case, as I'll come on to show you. And hopefully this should come without causing any issues with airflow. In terms of our front I/O, we've got two USB Type A ports, a single Type C port, and a combined headphone and microphone jack. If you prefer, it is possible to relocate the I/O module to the rear of the case. Our case's one and only dust filter is at the bottom, and it can simply be pulled out from the side for cleaning. In terms of fan and radiator mounting options, on the side of the case it's up to 4 120mm fans or up to a 360mm radiator. On the top it's up to 3 120mm fans or up to a 360mm radiator, while on the rear it's up to 2 120mm fans or up to a 240mm radiator. It is important to mention in these three locations you can't fit either a 140mm fan or 280mm radiator, and you have to go in multiples of 120. At the bottom of the case it's up to 3 120 or 3 140mm fans and up to a 360 or 280mm radiator. In terms of mounting fans and radiators at the side, we've got a removable bracket which is held on with a thumb screw at the top, and once it's been removed, the bracket can be tilted forward and lifted away. While you can mount up to 4 120mm fans on the side, if you've only got 3 fans, you don't need to worry about having a large gap either side of the fans. Phanteks will include 2 magnetic cover plates which will go either side of these 3 120mm fans and block off the cutout, not only improving the look of the build significantly, but also improving the airflow in the case. We've also got a removable fan bracket at the bottom of the case which is held on with a thumb screw at the back, and this bracket can be installed in 2 different positions. In a standard position, the fans at the bottom will be facing straight up, while if we turn the bracket round 180 degrees, The bottom is then on an incline, and any fans installed at the bottom will be facing towards the side of the case. To install your fans at the rear of the case, there's a removable mesh panel that you're going to need to remove. It's held on with one screw at the back, and once it's removed, the panel can be tilted down and lifted away. The idea behind this removable panel is if you want to go with a radiator at the rear, you're going to be able to install it in the rear compartment behind the mesh door at the back. So you can see here with two 120mm fans set into space, we've got plenty of space above them for the tubes to come through, so your radiator is going to be nicely hidden in the rear compartment behind the mesh panel, and it's going to look really clean. In terms of motherboard support, as you'd expect in a case of this size, it does support motherboards up to A80X in size, and if you want to go with a CPU air cooler, the maximum height supported is 185mm. At the rear of the case, we've got 8 horizontal PCI expansion slot covers, and in terms of graphics card support, you shouldn't have any problem fitting a large graphics card in this case, with a maximum length of 450mm being supported. You don't need to worry about your graphics card sagging either, because in the case accessory box, we get this very nice GPU support bracket. Your motherboard should really stand out in this case because we've got two really nice ARGB lighting bars, one above and one to the right of the motherboard. These ARGB panels also do a really good job in hiding the cables around the motherboard. They are removable for the build process. The panel at the top we need to simply push towards the right hand side and then lift it down and out. While to remove the panel to the right hand side of the motherboard, there's a thumb screw at the back we need to remove, and then we can slide the panel down and again pull it forward and lift away. So with the panel removed, you can see it does a great job of hiding the two large rubber grommets over to the right hand side of the motherboard. The panel over to the right hand side of the motherboard can be installed in two different orientations depending on the motherboard sizing that you're planning on using. If you're going with an ATX motherboard, you just install it in the standard orientation, whereas if you're going with an ATX motherboard, you can flip the bracket round, and this will give you more room over to the right hand side for your larger motherboard. Another really important thing to point out is we've got absolutely loads of room above the motherboard, so if you are planning with a push-pull configuration or going with a custom loop with a thick radiator, this case has got you covered. Moving into our rear compartment, you can see our power supply is going to go at the top, and the case is compatible with full-sized ATX power supplies up to a maximum length of 255mm. In the middle of the case, we've got a large cutout for all our cables, and we've got plenty of Velcro cable straps for cable management. At the top of the case, we've got our dual channel ARGB controller, which comes with 4 JST ports for you to plug your ARGB devices into. And you're going to be able to control the ARGB effects and everything plugged into the controller using the 4 buttons on the top of the case. If you prefer, there is a cable in the case accessory box which you can plug into the bottom port and the other end into an ARGB header on your motherboard, and this will let your motherboard control the lighting effects and everything plugged into the controller. Working down the case, in the middle we've got a door we can open by loosening a captive thumb screw. And if you look behind this, you'll notice we've got a little compartment to manage some of our cables in. There's also 2 pins on the back of the door, which is designed to wrap your EPS and 24-pin cables through, helping hide any excess cables from the main compartment. There's also the option to mount 2 2.5-inch SSDs on this panel. We've got another door at the bottom of the case, so we can loosen the captive thumb screw, and this door simply tilts down. So on the right-hand side of this door, you're going to be able to mount a 3.5-inch drive, while on the left hand side you can either mount a 3.5-inch drive or up to 4 2.5-inch drives. There's a little removable panel. Again, we can remove a captive thumb screw and lift this panel off, and in between these 2 panels you're going to be able to mount up to your 4 2.5-inch drives. If you don't want to go with any 3.5-inch drives and just 4 2.5-inch drives, you can spread these out a little bit more by installing 2 drives on the main panel over to the left hand side, and then the removable panel you can put 2 drives on and move that up onto the main body of the case. For the build process, this panel is fully removable. All you need to do is pull it towards the front of the case to remove it, and that's then going to give you better access to the cutouts below the motherboard. So what I want to do now is give you a look at the build I put together in the case. So I think you'll agree this build looks absolutely stunning, and I think a large part of that is due to the new Phanteks D3120 fans, which are absolutely brilliant. And I love this two-tone lighting effect that comes directly from the case's built-in ARGB controller. So the build looks good, but what about the temperatures? So our i7-13700K being cooled with a 360mm AIO at the top set to exhaust in push-pull configuration, idled at 33 degrees and reached a maximum of 82 degrees during a 10-minute Ida64 stability test. Our Aorus Master RTX 3070 idled at 26 degrees and reached a maximum of 51 degrees during the 10-minute Ida64 stability test. In terms of average noise levels, these were 32 decibels at idle and 54 decibels under load. So in terms of the temperatures, these are excellent, although it probably shouldn't come as a big surprise to you, given the fact that we've got push-pull configuration on the radiator and a total of 15 fans in the case. What probably does come as a big surprise is the fact with all these fans running, the noise levels at idle were only 32 decibels, which is incredibly quiet, which is a really good indication that as well as looking good, these new Phanteks fans also run nice and quiet at low revs per minute. Whenever the PC was under stress and the fans kicked up, the noise levels under load were actually in the moderate to high range. But with this particular system, because the temperatures were so good under load, there's plenty of scope to bring those noise levels down by just adjusting the fan curves. For the thermal testing, I always just run on the stock motherboard fan curves. So now I want to come on to any problems I had during the build, and being such a big case, building in it should be fairly straightforward, given the fact that we've got loads of space and with the tempered glass panel off at the front during the build, loads of access to build as well. And that was generally fairly straightforward, although the case's size, particularly its height, did bring a few problems. The first problem was because the power supply is installed all the way at the back, and we've got a large graphics card with a 12-volt high power connector quite near the front of the case. There's actually quite a big distance between the power supply and that connector, and the 12-volt high power cable that I had installed and pulled all the way tight to the front was never going to reach the front of the graphics card, and if it did, there would be a massive bend at the cable right near the connector where it wouldn't not only look good, but would also be potentially dangerous and putting pressure on the connector. So another slight issue you might have with the power supply location at the top, and it's not unique to this case, it's an issue shared by any case where the power supply is at the top, and that is the cable running from the power supply to the wall is going to be much shorter once it comes out the bottom of the case. Most cases the power supply is at the bottom, so you've got the full use of the cable and you can reach quite a distance with it. In this case, the cable is going to be hidden behind the mesh panel running to the bottom, and given that this is quite a tall case, a large proportion of your power supply is going to be in the mesh panel at the back of the case. So you're going to have a much shorter run of it to reach the wall, and it might not actually reach if you've pre-routed all your cables already. So it might just not be a simple matter of putting this on your desk and your existing cable reaching. You might actually need to get an extension cable or reroute some of the cables that you've already managed. Another issue where you might get into trouble in this case is the fan cables. The cables that come with these new D3120 fans from Phanteks are really long, and I had no trouble at all routing the cables to the fan headers on the motherboard. But if you go with different fans, or if your headers are located in different positions on the motherboard, given that the case is so tall, you might have some issues routing some of your cables. And like what I needed with a 12-volt high power cable, you might need to use some extensions for your fans as well. So another potential problem you might have in this case, given its large height, and in particular the large gap between the top of the motherboard and the top of the case, is in mounting your AIO. And if you want to mount your AIO at the top like I have done, whenever I first sized up this AIO, because the tubes need to come out the bottom of the water block, and whenever I put it straight on at the top, there was quite a bit of tension on the tubes, and they were running at a really straight, awkward looking angle with quite a bit of pressure on both the connectors. So there was two ways I tried to fix this problem. The first was I couldn't obviously rotate the tubes on the water block because it wouldn't have looked right. The first thing I did was install the radiator as far towards the back of the case as possible to help reduce any tension. And the second thing that worked really well was actually installing a push-pull configuration at the top. Bringing the radiator down that little bit, I was then able to get a little bit of curve in the tubes. So the push-pull configuration definitely helped from that point. The other thing I think it definitely helped with as well was aesthetics at the top of the case. Obviously the large gap at the top of this case is designed, if you're going with a custom loop, allowing you to have a really thick radiator. And I think the push-pull configuration just helped fill this space. And if the radiator had been moved up and hidden behind this black compartment and you were just seeing these fans here, I think the gap at the top would actually look too much. Whereas the way I've got it here, I think it actually looks pretty good. So while push-pull configuration solved one problem, and that was the aesthetics at the top of the case, it did bring me an additional problem during that build, and it was getting the right size of screws to go down from the case through the fans and into the radiator. And the screws to begin with the DeepCool AIO were 30mm in length, and they just weren't long enough. I did have some separate radiator screws that were 32mm in length, and again they were still a bit too short. The Phanteks fans came with radiator screws that were 36mm in length, and these worked fairly well. In fact, I was able to get them through and screwed in the push-pull configuration without any difficulty. The only slight problem was these screws were just a little bit too long. Whenever I had them put in fully tight, the radiator was still mobile at the top of the case. So the way I solved this problem was using the 36mm Phanteks radiator screws with a little washer on them, and that was perfect. Once they were installed, the radiator didn't budge at all. But again, it's a slight issue you might be getting into if you're planning a push-pull configuration at the top. And with the hardware that I've used, probably 34 to 35mm radiator screws is what you're going to need. So another slight issue I had with the build was getting the ARGB cable covers back on. Once I had used cable extensions for our EPS and 24-pin cables, it was incredibly difficult. So my advice if you're planning on building in this case is think carefully about using the cable extensions, because it's going to make the build that bit more difficult. And because actually these cable covers do such a good job of hiding your cable extensions, you're not really going to see very much of them. So I think if I was building again in this case, I wouldn't use cable extensions for the 24-pin or EPS cables. So now I want to come on to the things I liked about this case, and there's absolutely loads I like about this case. The first thing is the size. I love big cases. I'm able to fit all the hardware that I want into it. It's not squished in. There's loads of good airflow in it, and we can get some pretty good temperatures. I also think this case looks really, really good. So I think the tempered glass on the front and the tempered glass on the side works very well, and I love the fact that there's almost a seamless joint between the two panels. The tint in the tempered glass I think is just right for me. It's a fairly light tint to it, so when you look in, you are able to see your build through it without any difficulty. As well, I think the build quality in this case is exceptional throughout, but really coming from Phanteks, that's just going to be what you're going to expect. The mesh door in the back of the case I absolutely love. I think this is such a smart idea, and it really makes the back of the case look lovely and clean and tidy. As well, I think the method of securing the cables at the back, where you simply push your cables into these little slots and it holds them in place, works really well. I have had some other cases where there's actually been Velcro cable straps to manage all your cables coming down. The Fractal Torrent is an example of that. And those Velcro straps were an absolute pain when you were taking the cables in and out. In here, you're going to simply be able to slot the cables in and out of those little slots in a couple of seconds. So it's really functional, but also makes everything look really clean. I thought the choices they've made with the fan and radiator brackets was also pretty smart. It's nice to have 4 fans on the side, whereas if you only want to go with 3, having those little cover plates I think is a really good idea. It makes the build look really clean and also should improve the case's airflow. I love the fact that you're able to rotate the fans on the bottom bracket, and again I think having them on a little tilt really improves the aesthetics of the build. And I love the fact that you can actually mount a 240mm in the rear compartment hidden behind the mesh door, and I think that's a really smart idea as well. Another thing I love about this case is how it manages the ARGB. The ARGB lighting bar going around the motherboard looks really good, and I love the fact that you've got a really good built-in ARGB controller with 2 different channels on it and really good built-in ARGB effects on it. Another thing I really liked about the case was the included GPU support bracket. I think the one that's included did a great job of supporting the graphics card and also looked really clean. So now I want to come on to the things I didn't like about the case, and there really is only a few small points to mention here. So the first is, while I've given the RGB controller loads of praise for having dual channel control and lots of really good built-in ARGB effects, the only additional thing I would like added to it is the ability to control both channels at once. It works very well, the dual channel, if you want different effects on each of the channels, but if you want both of them set up exactly the same way, you're going to have to set up one channel in terms of mode, speed and color, and then go in and make exactly the same adjustments in the second channel. And it'd be nice to have some way to sync up the two channels. Now there may be a way to do it, I just wasn't able to find it either from playing about with the buttons or searching in the manual. The other thing I want to mention is, while I think this case's ARGB is excellent, the one thing missing for me, particularly in a case of this price point, is a fan hub. And I think a little fan hub in beside the ARGB hub would have made this case absolutely perfect. So again, I've praised the removable brackets at the side, at the bottom and at the rear, and the only place that doesn't have a removable bracket is the top of the case. And given, as I mentioned, there's such a large gap between the top of the motherboard and the top of the case, I think a lot of people will think about doing a push-pull configuration at the top of this case. And that would be so much easier if there was a removable bracket. So you're not having to support the weight of the radiator, try and get a screw down from the top, lined up in through the fans and into the radiator. And doing that with a removable fan bracket would be so much easier. The final thing to mention at the back of the case was the cable management. So Phanteks recommend routing your 24-pin and EPS cables in behind that middle door. And I did try that, but I think probably largely because I had used cable extensions, I then wasn't able to get that door closed, and I was worried about it putting some pressure on the back of the motherboard. So I ended up only routing the 24-pin cable behind it and running the EPS cables down at the bottom of the motherboard, and actually ended up having to route quite a few cables behind the bottom door as well. So while this end solution did actually work fairly well and the cables at the back looked reasonably tidy, if I was planning on using that bottom door for hard drives or SSDs, it mightn't have worked so well. And while the Velcro cable straps in the main compartment did hold all the cables, I just didn't think it did as good a job as the cable management you get in the back of the Lian Li 011 Dynamic Evo. And I think what probably would have worked better in this case is actually some metal cable clips that you actually just pushed your cables in behind, and then you could have a central cable cover like the 011 Dynamic Evo does that goes directly over the cables in that main compartment. So I don't think moving the cables over to compartments at the side worked very well. Although importantly, I did use cable extensions in this build, and as I've mentioned, I think is probably unnecessary. So if you were trying to manage your standard power supply cables without cable extensions, I think the solution that Phanteks have provided will probably work fairly well and look much neater. But I just wasn't completely happy with the cable management at the back of the case. There was too much cables pushed into that compartment behind the motherboard for my liking, and had I wanted to mount hard drives or SSDs at the bottom, I would have struggled. So we've now reached the stage in the review where I need to tell you, should you go out and get this case? And in short, yes you should. It is absolutely brilliant. In terms of pricing, at just under $220, I think you are getting an awful lot for your money, not only in terms of the size, but in terms of the features, the build quality, the aesthetics and the cooling that this case is going to offer. So I think you are most definitely getting what you are paying for. And providing you can afford this case, I think it offers incredibly good value for money, so I can 100% recommend it. And I think this case is probably so good that I might be taking a look at it again towards the end of the year when we're looking at Case of the Year. It's in pole position at the moment, and we'll see what the rest of the year brings. So to bring me back to my other question, is it going to be replacing the Lian Li 011 Dynamic Evo behind me? Yes, it is. So you can get used to seeing it beside the half 700 Evo on the desk behind me in the videos going forward. So hopefully you have enjoyed this case review, and if you are thinking of doing a build in the Phanteks NV7, I've made a full step-by-step build guide in the case, and if you are thinking of doing a build, you most definitely are going to want to check that out, so I'll put a link to that video in the description. As well, if you have enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up, and if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.